Good morning. This is the lecture number 28A in the series The ABCs of Communism. And you will recall that when we were talking about Mexico, I promised that we would get back to this, all of these Latin American countries, and finish them up in terms of bringing them from a certain date, which in the case of Mexico was roughly 1940 when we stopped, up to the present time. Well, the 2016 version of this ABC's book will be out in another 6 months, but since I've already started writing it, I thought we might as well go ahead and make some more videos, because many of you have mentioned to me that you would like to continue these Latin American stories for each country right now. So I'll do the best I can over the coming months to present the data. Generally speaking, I think you can think of 1974 as the beginning of a period when the empire strikes back, that's not a hard date, because obviously they had been striking back for years before that, against Guatemala, against Guyana, against Cuba, and so on. But they had been steadily losing these fights. In Guatemala, it turned into a civil war which went on almost to the present day. In Guyana, they lost eventually to Che Guevara and his people. Only recently they have tried to stir up trouble again by putting Mobile Exxon off the Guyana border in waters claimed by Venezuela as well as Guyana. They've done what they could to overthrow the legitimate government in Honduras, and now they're confronted with a serious problem there. My point is that their troublemaking has never stopped. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean we can't periodize their troublemaking. By our Star Wars analogy, think of the Empire in that movie and its location of the rebel base. In our real world, the Empire had located the rebel base. They knew it was in Cuba. They now intended to do undo everything that the rebel progressive forces in Latin America had been undertaking, and they proceeded to try to do so in every country south of the Rio Grande. They were confident that imperial forces could wrap up the Vietnamese, and they wanted to take advantage of the opportunity their frustration demanded by assaulting the progressive beachheads in Latin America. As 1964 began, so did the Empire's plan to strike back. It continues through over half a century of torturous years to the present day, and although they are now losing definitively, they know of no other course except that road ruling classes have been following for 6,000 years. Now, I just said 1974 because when we get into these, you're going to see that in Peru, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, they mounted fascist counter-revolutionary attacks against progressive governments beginning around 1974. But we haven't gotten to those countries yet, so what we're going to do is start with Mexico. And you'll recall that we left our story of the fight for communism in Mexico with a few comments on how Pemex had developed in the years after the nationalization of the oil fields there. I'm not going to rehash that for you right now. You can read it in the chapter when it comes. But what I want to get started with is the period when I first got into Mexico, and I like to think of it as the period where gringo fascism meets Mexican fascism, and the key president was Adolfo López Mateos. In chapter 30, I was concentrating on the fight for communism in Mexico from the perspective of Leninism versus capitalism in the first 2 decades after Borodin's arrival. Now, in the subsequent 75 years, the struggle of world capital against Mexico has gone through several stages, and it's now our task to periodize this history in Marxist-Leninist terms, and we shall begin with the regime of López Mateos, which also happens to be, as I said, when I first arrived in Mexico en route to Cuba on September 1st, 1962. Accordingly, I shall be able to pass on to you readers insights and viewers obtained then and over the subsequent decades about the internal politics of Mexico. Let's take a look at this man himself. Adolfo López Mateos, ALM, by the way, it's always been commonplace in the Mexican press to refer to the president by his 3 initials. So in every newspaper you'll see it'll say ALM in this case, or depending on whoever it is, it'll be the 3 initials. rather than the president or his full name. At any rate, Lopez Mateos served the presidential term from 58 to 1964. He was the first self-styled left president since Lázaro Cárdenas. In reality, he was the Mexican ruling class favorite, an old-fashioned fascist of the Juan Perón and Eva Duarte type, who believed in a place for labor and always labor in its place. We might say he was a Mexican Peronista. ALM's leadership of the official party had begun in 1934 when he became a private secretary for the president of the PRI, when he was still the PNR, another pre-PRI form. His work for the PRI, or just from now on we'll just call it the PRI, intensified when he was co-opted by Isidro Favela. Favela himself having a long and honored history of the Mexican Revolution and always an adherent of the winning side, and its ultimate leader in those days, the early days, Plutarco Elias Calles, and the PRI, you recall it, Calles won the dogfight for the presidency when he won the election in 1924. Favela had begun his life as an intellectual, and in 1912 and 1913 had been professor at the Literary Institute of Mexico. In 1942, Favela was elected as governor of the state of Mexico. He had then appointed Lopez Mateos as director of the Literary Scientific Institute of that state, which is then located in Toluca. This was the successor institution to the Library Institute, or Literary Institute, where he himself had begun his career nearly a half-century earlier. When Favela was elected pre-senator from the state of Mexico in 1946, the state of Mexico, by the way, is right next to the federal district, and if you're in Mexico City, you hardly notice the difference as you're driving down the freeway from the federal district into the state of Mexico, but at any rate, that's where it is. He had started his career as a pre-senator from the state of Mexico in 46. He then nominated his favorite intellectual, Adolfo Lopez Mateos, to succeed him as an alternate senator. When Favela was sent to the Mexican Court of Justice to defend his interests via the imperialism, especially U.S. imperialism, Lopez Mateos automatically stepped up, therefore, to the Mexican Senate. In 1952, Lopez Mateos became a member of President Adolfo Luis Cortines, ALC in the Mexican press, government as minister, that is, Secretary for Labor, after he proved his Mexican ruling class credentials by suppressing the railroad workers' strike. He was selected by Adolfo Luis Cortines to succeed himself as president in 1958. In the Mexican system, the existing president selects his successor personally. It's called giving the finger, by which they don't mean the rude gesture, they mean pointing to this guy. He's going to be the next president. Now that's the way the PRI always ran things, and we had recently a 12-year interregnum where the PAN, National Action Party, did things their way, but we're back with the PRI system again. Who knows whether this guy is going to last or not? I kind of doubt it. At any rate, so ALM had, however, Lopez Mateo, a long and interesting pre-1934 history as an opposition voice to the PRI's predecessors, often leaning to what we might today call the left parties and peculiarly right tendencies. Therefore, his arrival in the presidency was in fact the final destination of a person with a well-known history of leftism of the Peronista variety. In Chapter 30, I referred to the official party as the PRI because it eventually officially adopted this name in 1946 under President Manuel Ávila Camacho, MAC. The PRI claims its origins under the first post-Diaz president Francisco Madero of 1910. His name we have used for the government or official party ever since, even during the brief pawn regime of CIA-preferred presidents Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón. Originally, the PRI was called the National Revolutionary Party and later the Party of the Mexican Revolution, but for our purposes, we will always just refer to it as the PRI. The President. Lopez Mateos served the Republic as PRI president from 1958 through his entire 6-year term until 1964. He was therefore in power when I first arrived in Mexico City September 1st, 1962. I was on my way to Cuba at the invitation of longtime Cuban communist leader Juan Marinello. Accompanying me on this trip was an old friend from Idaho, my same age, named John Robertson. While I had been in Seattle earlier in 1962 searching for Steve Nelson at the address provided to me by Gus Hall in January of '62, a letter had arrived at my home in Boise. That would have been around June, I believe. And he was accepting me as a student at the University of Havana. John was kind of along for the ride. So at the end of August, we departed Boise with a huge box of books on the Greyhound bus. At Laredo, Texas, we had crossed the border and bought tickets on the Aztec Eagle, Mexico's most popular railroad train, at that time anyway. Mostly it was popular with Mexicans, and I've described that trip in detail in my book, The Buccaneer, Volume 1, in the series Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. You can find it in libraries if it and type in my name, or you can get a copy of it in its second edition at Kindle Books at Amazon.com. At any rate, while John and I were staying at the Hotel Texas in Mexico City, I had been busy at the Cuban Embassy arranging my travel to Havana to attend the university as per the letter from Comrade Marinello. I also had some information I thought might be useful or helpful to the Cubans defending the revolution against the upcoming Gringo invasion plot. About this information, John had never had a need to know, and so therefore I had kept this part of our trip to myself. The upcoming invasion, on the other hand, was an open secret in the U.S. press, and so something everybody in Mexico was talking about, or everybody I met anyway. John had been busy searching the city for a cheaper locale for us to occupy while we waited for clearance from the Cubans. The problem was that since the invasion was imminent, all travel to Cuba had been suspended from both ends for the moment, and that is from Mexico as well as from Cuba. So we needed to find a cheaper quarters while we waited this thing out. John found them at a pension owned by the sister-in-law of longtime Mexican communist David Alfaro Siqueiros. This find was purely accidental, and it accidentally led to the most important Mexican contacts of my life, Carlos and Evelyn Prieto. When I came down the stairs the first morning after we moved in, I heard a young girl giving a lecture in English on dialectical and historical materialism. She was talking to a group of vacationing oil field workers from Utah that John had met somewhere, and told them about this inexpensive pension, which is another way of saying apartments for rent, this building. They were listening politely, probably as fascinated as was I, but that such a young girl, only 7 years old, could talk like this. Julieta Bastard, the proprietress, told me that she was one of 2 daughters of Carlos and Evelyn Prieto, and that they wanted to meet me as soon as possible. We'll return to this young girl later. She would be murdered in a few years, at 19 years of age, by the butcher president Luis Echeverria. To begin with, the Prieto family had just returned to Mexico from New York City, where Carlos had been a chief information officer at the United Nations. Carlos had been forced to flee Mexico when the government went looking for him and other leaders of the 1958 railroad strike. What was that all about? Well, we're going to have to take a look at that for a minute, because it was a seminal moment in the history of Mexican communism. In the summer of 1958, railroad workers at Local 13 of the STFRM, the Railroad Workers Union of the Mexican Republic, in the town of Matias Romero in the state of Oaxaca, began a series of protest strikes over hours, safety, working conditions, and wages, which began of 2 hours duration. Eventually these strikes were expanded to 4 hours, 6 hours, and 8 hours in length. And on June 28th of 1958, the Railroad Workers Union called for a general strike nationwide of all unions against the regime. Several unions, including the teachers and the electrical workers, immediately signed up, and the all-important oilfield workers union, STPRM, that we talked so much about in the chapter in the lecture on Mexico last, was expected to answer the call next. The president, Ruiz Cortines, was scared shitless, as was the entire ruling class establishment. He ordered his Minister for Labor, Adolfo Lopez Mateos to intervene and establish some common grounds between labor and the government. Lopez Mateos did so and demanded that the Union replace as General Secretary Demetrio Vallejo with a government-approved person. The Union refused, and in a special election, Vallejo was supported overwhelmingly in his position as General Secretary by over 57,000 votes with only 9 dissenting votes. Lopez Mateos responded by sending federal cops to seize the STFRM offices, union halls, and arrest its leaders on August 3, 1958. The fight would continue till 1959, but by that time Mexico had a new president. The fight between the government and the Union would continue until 1959, but by that time Mexico had a new president, Adolfo Lopez Mateos. Lopez Mateos had proved his Peronista credentials by his willingness to suppress left opposition within the labor movement, which of course included leadership by the Mexican Communist Party, as well as independent leftists like Vallejo, who would, however, rejoin the Mexican Communist Party in 1960 while he was in prison. Accordingly, ALM was the man of the moment for the PRI, and the PRI leaders accepted him when Luis Cortines gave him the finger. And I just explained that expression to you a moment ago. In the following year, ALM sent the Army and federal cops, and now he's president, to seize the Mexican Communist Party leaders, and this included Carlos Prieto, the excuse being that the Soviet embassy had sent a suitcase full of cash to the strikers, specifically to PCM leaders including Valentin Campo and Carlos Prieto. Now, Carlos Prieto's father, however, was an old-school fascist of the Mussolini, Hitler, Chiang Kai-shek, J. Edgar Hoover variety, all of whom Carlos' father had met and plotted with in years past, and he was founder of the Latin American Anti-Communist League. So the cops were afraid to enter Carlos' home first. Eventually, however, the old man had given his permission, and Carlos and Evelyn and their children had had to flee to Evelyn's native New York City, where Carlos got the job just described at the United Nations. When I met them, they had only been back in Mexico City a few days, and they were anxious to explain all of this to me in even more detail, and I've discussed it in more detail than I'm going to discuss here in Volume 1 of my autobiography. Carlos immediately checked at the Cuban embassy on me, and they gave him the high sign that I was okay with them, as the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain, leaders had done with them for me earlier, as I have described in that same first volume of my autobiography. The Prietos were at Julieta's pension because Julieta Bastard was the sister-in-law of David Alfaro Siqueiros, and they knew her and they knew the place. And because, as it turned out, Discovery John was a well-known place for communist and other left students to live while attending university, working, or whatever. John did a favor to Julieta Bastard when he got her place listed as an excellent place for U.S. students to live while traveling through Mexico in the guidebook we had been using then, entitled Mexico on $5 a Day. That same book still comes out, but it's a lot more than $5 a day today. Carlos had been given a pardon by Lopez Mateos and had been allowed to return to Mexico. Thus our fateful meeting. Now, what about Lopez Mateos' Peronism in practice? Lopez Mateos did not get along with Ike, that is Eisenhower, because he refused to buckle under to Eisenhower's insistence that Mexico support the U.S. in its foreign wars. When JFK was elected, Lopez Mateos greeted the election as a progressive change for Mexico, but soon split with Kennedy over Cuba. Mexico always thereafter maintained relations with Cuba, and for many years was the only Latin American country to have the audacity to do so. The Mexican ruling class knows that the gringo billionaires are their most dangerous enemies because they can outcompete them whenever they wish to. By the time I arrived in Mexico City for the first time on September 1st, 1962, the gringo conspirators against Cuba and their secret bases had been kicked out of the country. That did not stop the CIA from putting 24-hour-day gumshoes on both John and I as we moved around the federal district. We took a somewhat youthful delight in laying in wait for one of these clowns in particular, who seemed to be about 7 feet tall. He was easy to spot walking down a street full of Mexicans. I wanted his photo in order to take this photograph to the Cuban embassy for IDing, which I did. And we found out he was, one of their CIA spies. But at any rate, unloved in Gringolandia, Lopez Mateos was much loved by the poor farming class of Mexico and millions of other Mexicans when he expanded the ejido system of giving land grants to landless farmers and creating Mexico's social security system. He was following in the footsteps and by the book of Juan Perón and Evita Duarte. One of his first acts was to create the National Commission for Free Textbooks. During ALM's administration, nearly 20% of Mexico's government investment was directed into social welfare programs of all kinds. This included the first national program for medical services for poor children under the National Institute for the Protection of Children. All of this created even more animosity in Washington that wanted only to exploit the cheapest possible labor both in Mexico and in the USA. This meant that the poor had to be kept as poor as possible so they would work for anything. This was classical liberal economics and now neoliberal economics. One long-lasting contribution of ALM was to create the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City. I have given lectures there twice in 1970 and 1980 and participated in one seminar, Professor Antonio Gilman's 1980 seminar on Marxism and Anthropology at the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting that year. Accordingly, Lopez Mateos has been one of my all-time personal Peronista favorites, certainly favorite Mexican president. Now, ALM gave the finger to his successor, a man named Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, GDO, who took the presidency from 1964 to 1970, which also happens to be the year, that is when he came into power in 1964. Gus Hall had started forcing me out of the CPUSA as one of the Chinese types Nikita Khrushchev had ordered him to get rid of. Even so, I had had several reasons during these years to revisit Mexico and the family of Carlos and Evelyn Prieto. One of Díaz Ordaz's first acts was to order the freeing of David Alfaro Siqueiros in the spring of 1964, and on one of my visits there, I happened to be at that exact moment in the home of Carlos and Evelyn when the president, Díaz Ordaz, called for Carlos. I've described that call and the subsequent events in The Buccaneer, Volume 1 of my autobiography, Idaho Smith's Search for the Foundation. And we'll outline what happened that day Siqueiros was freed again now. I recall that Evelyn Prieto had been called to the phone by a maid, and she came back into the room. She said, "Carlos, the president is on the phone." Carlos and I had been drinking, even though it was in the morning, and he was in a rather vociferous mood, and he said, "President of what?" She said, "The president of Mexico, Carlos, hurry." Carlos said upon his return, "I have to go and get Siqueiros. He is being released at Lecumberri, which is a prison, as we speak. Do you want to go?" He asked his wife, and she had responded that she would rather wait until Siqueiros was settled, wherever he was going. However, she suggested that he take me. Carlos asked me. I eagerly concurred. We were off in a taxi. We arrived at Lecumberri prison just as Comrade Siqueiros was walking out the front gate. He was greeted by Carlos, who walked briskly to him. I recall he said that he didn't know either till an hour earlier that he was leaving that day. So, well, for whatever it's worth. So they spoke in Spanish. Carlos introduced me. I got in the front seat while those two sat in the back. A taxi driver was taking us to Cuernavaca. After we got there, I broke my silence at his invitation, and he spent several hours with me. Cuernavaca, for those of you who don't know, is a major, colorful, artistic kind of town to the south of, about an hour south of Mexico City, on the freeway. Well, at any rate, I won't bother going into more of that conversation right now because I've already gone over it in the book about The Buccaneer, the first volume of my autobiography. But let's take a look at who David Alfaro Siqueiros was. He's one of Los Tres Grandes, the big three Mexican muralists, Orozco, Rivera, and Siqueiros. David Alfaro Siqueiros was the youngest of these, born in Chihuahua State in 1896. He was the most politically radical, which is saying a lot, because Rivera and Orozco were pretty radical too. If you want to see a good portrayal of this, look at Salma Hayek's movie called Frida. And an early member of Jose Allen's Communist Party of Mexico. Siqueiros joined in 1920. David's earliest political motivations seem to have been provided to him by his sister Luz, who was 3 years older than he. When their mother died, David was only 4 years old. His wealthy father sent the children to live with his parents, that is, the father's parents, who were willing to step in and raise them. Luz, his sister, developed an early dislike for the Catholic discipline and ideology of the time, and passed this on to David as he grew up. By the time he was 10 years old, he came under the rebellious art theory of Dr. Atl, Gerardo Murillo, or Geraldo Murillo, however you want to pronounce it, an anarcho-syndicalist. Now, you remember from the last lectures I did, especially on Argentina and Brazil, that anarcho-syndicalism was the predominant ideology of much of the Spanish and Italian left of that year, 1906. In Brazil and Argentina, and of course in Italy and Spain. So Siqueiros enrolled at any rate in San Carlos Academy, where Dr. Atl was the chief. Therefore, when Michael Barodin arrived in Mexico City in October 1919, which we discussed in our last lecture on Mexico, Siqueiros was in Europe traveling and studying art, first in Paris and then with Diego Rivera in Italy. After his return, David entered the Communist Party of Mexico, quickly rising as one of its brightest prospects. Again, Dr. Atl was the pen name of Gerardo Murillo Coronado, who lived from 1874 to 1964. He used the moniker Dr. Atl to sign his artwork, as well as some things that he published, including in 1906 a manifesto where he called for the development of monumental public art in Mexico as a mass movement of intellectuals. It was to be linked to the lives and interests of the Mexican common people. As such, it is the most important single theoretical precursor to the Mexican mural movement launched in 1922 by Jose Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. However, the 1910 revolution against Porfirio Diaz and for a progressive new nation put the mural movement in temporary stasis. These guys were going into the army, the Revolutionary Army. This is how it came to pass that the political activity of all three and the frequent imprisonment of Siqueiros was an integral part of his artistic career. This is exactly the way David wanted to lead his life. He once told me in that 1974 conversation, I mentioned the day he was liberated by Diaz Ordaz, he said, when we were in Cuernavaca, among many other things during the few hours he took to speak with me, he said, quote, as best as I can recall, if you're going to be a serious revolutionary, then you better get used to the idea of spending a lot of time behind bars, which is better for the cause than being dead, unquote. I never forgot that part. Siqueiros' involvement with the armed struggle, which was the Mexican Revolution, began at the age of 18 when he joined the Revolutionary Constitutional Army of Venustiano Carranza. In this, he and Orozco were following the lead of their mentor, Dr. Atl, director of their Academy of San Carlos, who had earlier joined up with the Constitutional Army forces of Carranza. You may recall that Carranza, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, along with the Sonorans, led by Plutarco Elias Calles, were unified on one thing, and that was the overthrow of Victoriano Huerta. The new U.S. stooge and self-declared president of Mexico had to go. When they overthrew him, they agreed upon a placeholder named Alvaro Obregón. At any rate, the San Carlos Academy III had taken charge of a new project for Carranza, which was the army newspaper entitled La Vanguardia. Then in 1921, Siqueiros published his first theoretical work as a Jose Allen communist theoretician entitled Vida Americana. In 1922, the San Carlos III kicked off their oft-delayed muralist movement with the publication of Folk Arts of Mexico in 2 volumes, which provided the intellectual rationale for the previous 3 years' campaign presenting dance, art, crafts, and music for the masses. As I say, the placeholder for the four horsemen of the apocalypse was Alvaro Obregón. In his government, José Vasconcelos Calderón was the secretary or minister for public education, and Siqueiros, Rivera, and Orozco were now working for him. Vasconcelos was already one of Mexico's leading intellectuals. His career is beyond the scope of this textbook, but if you're interested, you could easily do some research on it. Meanwhile, in 1920, Siqueiros had demonstrated his unwillingness to be an ivory tower intellectual when he organized one of the first 20th century Mexican mine workers' union. Yes, mines. And in 1923, Siqueiros helped found the Syndicate of Revolutionary Mexican Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers. This union's first task was to gain public access to the art of the world, especially the proletarian world. And this it did through its newspaper El Machete. That year, the paper published for the proletariat of the world a manifesto which Siqueiros helped author on the necessity of collective art, which would serve as ideological propaganda to educate the masses and overcome bourgeois individualist art. You want to remember that this is long before the TV epoch, and radio has just barely gotten started, so that this kind of activity on the part of artists was all that the masses had in the way of entertainment. Soon after Siqueiros painted his famous mural Burial of a Worker, that is in 1923, in the stairway of the Colegio Chico. The fresco features groups of the pre-conquest style workers in a funeral procession who are carrying a giant coffin decorated with a hammer and sickle. As this revolutionary artists union took on the government, they lost funding. A decision that had to be made by them, that is within the union, over whether to cease publishing El Machete, their newspaper, or lose financial support for the mural projects. Diego Rivera left to pursue his murals, and Siqueiros stayed and took over. However, Plutarco Calles, as the new president, preferred Rivera's solution, as he already had his own newspapers. Therefore, in 1925, Calles, being the ultimate union boss, released Siqueiros. Siqueiros, however, remained seriously involved in labor activities in the Artists' Union as well as the Mexican Communist Party. Skip up to 1936, Siqueiros decided to join the movement for the Spanish Republican forces. Specifically, they were answering Comrade Stalin's August 1936 call for Comintern volunteers. Stalin said communists worldwide were to organize support in their home countries in the form of international brigades to come to the aid of the Spanish Republic. You will recall the Republican government of Spain was fighting the fascist forces of Francisco Franco and Juan March, who had risen in revolt in July of 36. And we discussed this extensively in chapter 16. It was the chance of everyone had been waiting for to fight fascism. Thus Siqueiros arrived in Spain in early 1937, commanding the battalion of Mexicans and assorted Latin Americans that the Mexican Communist Party had sent to fight in the Spanish Civil War, which, as you recall, was 1936 to 1939. After the war ended in defeat for the Republic, Siqueiros was called to Moscow to meet Joseph Stalin and Stalin's new Chica boss, Lavrenti Beria. Always a loyal communist, he orchestrated, that is, Siqueiros orchestrated the first unsuccessful, however, assassination attempt on Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in May of 1940. And apparently this is something that was discussed by him with Stalin and Beria at the time he was recalled from Spain in 1939, or 38 to 39. However, anticipating this possibility, Beria had a second man in place. He was another secret Comintern agent who had been working his way by parallel penetration into the background of Trotsky's life. When Siqueiros fucked up the first hit by failing to check and see if Trotsky was dead, he wasn't, he was hiding under the bed, and emerged from the storm of automatic weapons fire unscathed, Beria pulled out his other man to do the job a few months later. And I've already reviewed all of that for you in chapter 16. A detailed discussion of Siqueiros' art and artistic history is beyond the scope of this book. I just want to mention one thing, however. There are several excellent biographies available now about it, and there is on Olivera Street in Los Angeles, or close to it, what's called America Tropical Interpretive Center, and that was opened just 3 years ago. So those of you who live in LA certainly could go and look at it today if you wanted to, and others who go there to visit. Later, after this 1964 meeting, I took my new wife Rachel to Mexico City on our honeymoon in June of 1966. Evelyn Prieto went to Cuernavaca, was able to get Siqueiros to autograph and write a message on 2 prints of his work that she sent to us in Los Angeles, and my wife and I gave these to her parents and my mother. Now back to our story. During these Diaz Ordaz years, the government tightened its internal control as it confronted an increasingly rebellious populace, especially railroad workers, teachers, and medical doctors and hospital workers were pissed off and engaged in militant strike actions resulting in mass firings. It was inevitable that revolutionary guerrilla movements would first arise, and they began in the state of Guerrero. Economically, the era of Diaz Ordaz was a time of steady growth, and he established the Mexican Institute of Petroleum in 1965. Now we go to the Tlatelolco Massacre. That's spelled Tlatolco. Tlatelolco Massacre. When university students in Mexico City protested the government's action against education and medicine around the time of the 1968 Summer Olympics, Diaz Ordaz sent the army to occupy the National Autonomous University of Mexico and arrest student leaders. But the real culprit behind this action was the Interior Minister, Luis Echeverria. Echeverria later tried to blame this and the later Tlatelolco massacre on Diaz Ordaz when he was campaigning for the presidency. Not a very nice thing to do, since Diaz Ordaz had already given him the finger, which made him the next pre-president. But he was scared because Mexico had not forgotten about this massacre, and they knew what his role was in it, so he did his very best to say, "I'm sorry about the whole thing," and he implied that if it had been up to him, it wouldn't have happened. Well, in other words, he's blaming it on President Diaz Ordaz, which was a total lie. It was not Diaz Ordaz's idea. It was completely Luis Echeverria's idea. We'll talk about that later on, but the important thing is that it was Luis Echeverria had staked all of his money-making hopes on his tourist trinket hotel reservation racket and hot dog stand services for the Summer Olympics of '68. Now, that's not to say he hadn't been stealing a lot already, which he had been, because he married into a family of thieves, well-known Guadalajara criminals. His brother-in-law is in a U.S. federal prison today for the murder of a U.S. DEA agent, doing a life sentence. That's just typical of what the Arce family did in Guadalajara. And I think the reason that Luis Echeverria, as you're going to see when we get to him next, the reason that he wanted to marry the woman he did was to get into that crime family. But at any rate, what he did was, to make a long story short, when these students decided that they were unarmed and they were peaceful, and they went to the square of Tlatelolco in downtown Mexico City on the 2nd of October '68, he had that square surrounded by Special Army thugs and secret police thugs, and they opened fire on all of those demonstrators, and they killed hundreds or thousands. Nobody knows for sure, because no reliable figures have ever been published. And not only that, they chased them into houses, and they killed people that lived in the new houses that surrounded the square. So it was a real national disgrace, and it was a strain that would remain on the PRI for many years. Even to this day, Diaz Ordaz statue every year in Zapopan, Jalisco, the state of Jalisco is where Guadalajara is vandalized by having a bucket of red paint splattered on it. Now we get to the real thug, the guy I should have killed myself, named Luis Echeverria Alvarez. And I always planned on doing it, but I was always too busy. And this is the kind of thing that you have to do by yourself and never tell anybody about. And with a guy like this, of course, it's going to take a lot of planning, and you have to go there and do all of this. I just never had the time. Now I'm 73 years old, and after my aortic aneurysm of 2 years ago, it's all I can do to walk 2 miles a day. I don't know what kind of physical shape he's in, but he's 93 years old and he's still walking around. So he's like a lot of Nazis, that escaped retribution. Retribution for what? Well, we're going to get to that. I started this section the way I have by saying I should have killed him myself, because it's only fair to you students that I should be clear that I have a personal grudge against this particular fascist. For the Tlatelolco massacre was not the first time that he had engaged in something like this. He eventually murdered several students trying to educate poor farmers in Nepantla, Mexico, including the then 19-year-old youngest daughter of Carlos and Evelyn Prieto. Her name is Denis Prieto Stock. However, the first thing to remember about this particular son of a bitch and his wife is that they were always stone criminals and the mafia bosses of Guadalajara. I think the best personal insight I can give you comes from pillow talk I had with my one-time girlfriend, Leticia Mari, when she told me about the Echeverria's New Year's Eve party at Los Pinos. Los Pinos is the residency of the Mexican president, like the White House. The official residence and office of the President of Mexico is located in Chapultepec Forest in Mexico, in the Mexico City Center. Well, at any rate, my girlfriend had been married before, and she was divorced by the time I met her, of course, and she had been married to what sometimes described as Mexico's most flamboyant oil man, a guy that made $400 million in 10 years drilling for oil. I don't think I need to say very much more, named Armando Leyva Torres. At any rate, I remember she told me this story, which I think tells the whole story about Luis Echeverria and his wife. She said Armando and I were invited to Los Pinos for this New Year's Eve party, and of course we had to attend it. It was an honor, and anyway it would have been an insult if we had not. Armando's oil well drilling business depended upon government Pemex contracts, so we went. As you know, all pre-government and high Pemex officials are multimillionaires many times over, so the wives are dripping in diamonds at such events. However, my friend Lucia had told me, whatever you wear, do not wear anything you can't afford to lose. And naturally I asked her why. She said that the year before, at the New Year's Eve party at Los Pinos and at the stroke of midnight, Mrs. Echeverria, the Queen of Thieves of Guadalajara and the nation's First Lady, had announced that she was going to pass the plate, and that all the ladies had to donate their best jewelry that they were wearing for the Military Widows and Orphans Fund. Well, this was just a typical blatant lie that this pair always engaged in, and everyone knew it. But failure to donate your jewelry would result in devastating consequences. For example, that night, the wife of a government minister wrote a check for $250,000 US on one of her U.S. bank accounts. She said that her necklace had been in her family since the conquest, but the check for $250,000 US was its appraised value. Mrs. Echeverria took the check and cashed it the next day. It doesn't matter that the banks are closed on New Year's Day. When the boss lady tells them when to open, it does so immediately. At any rate, when the minister went to his office on the next working day, he found out he'd been fired. And that's a lesson that everybody learned. The same source told me that when the Echeverrias took over the presidency, that Mrs. Echeverria had taken charge of media and communications, and she ordered all the radio and TV stations in Mexico to bring all their advertising revenue directly to her office. She just took it, never accounted for it anywhere. I do not know how these companies stayed in business, Leticia said. I know some did not and were taken over by her offices, nationalized business operations, using some excuse or another. And I could keep telling you these stories, as you might imagine, but I think you get the picture. Back at the ranch, once Echeverria became president, he embarked on a far-reaching program of what he disguised as populist, political, and economic reforms. This included nationalizing the mining and electrical industries, not already owned by himself and his cronies. What he claimed was the redistribution to peasants of private lands in the state of Sonora and Sinaloa was really a redistribution to his cronies, for which he got kickbacks. However, many wealthy farmers not part of his gang refused to go along, and they hired private armies. And they resisted effectively the orders that he had given to redistribute their land. However, now, Luis Echeverria got revenge on them on the way out the door of his 6-year term, and he imposed limits on foreign investment, meaning foreign capitalists had to pay him now and forever for investment opportunities in the country. And he extended Mexico's patrimonial waters to 370 kilometers, or 230 miles. On the positive side, popular forces were able to force the Luis Echeverria administration to increase spending on education, health, housing, construction, and food subsidies. The percentage of the population covered by the Social Security system doubled. However, Luis Echeverria was not done with massacres. The next one occurred on June 10th, 1971, called the Corpus Christi Massacre. Corpus Christi is a town, as you may know, in Texas on the border, but at any rate there's a street in Mexico City called Corpus Christi. The Hawk Strike is named after a group of special killers in the Mexican army known as Los Halcones, the Hawks, who conducted another Mexico City massacre of student demonstrators on June 10, 1971. Like the earlier one Echeverria had organized, it happened on the day of the Corpus Christi festival. It told everyone that the nation's #1 Hitlerite type of fascist was in complete control. The student march that day started at Casco de Santo Tomas. They made their way along Carpio and Maestro avenues. The protesters intended to walk the Mexico to Cuba causeway, leading for the Zocalo. The police officers and riot police did not allow the students to pass and had blocked the streets leading to Maestro Avenue. There were urban control tanks parked along the Melchor Ocampo Avenue. And I later lived on the corner of Melchor Ocampo and that causeway when I was in the oil field service business, so to me I know exactly where it is, and it's about 2 blocks away from the Camino Real Hotel, which is has a long time been an official greeting place for foreign dignitaries meeting the president. And at any rate, more cops occupied locales near the military school. Riot police trucks and a large police contingent were stationed at the intersection of the Melchor Ocampo and San Cosme avenues. A shock troop trained by the Federal Security Directorate and the U.S. CIA, known as Los Halcones, came in gray trucks and vans. The Hawks launched an attack on the students from streets near Maestros Avenue after the riot police sprung the trap by opening their earlier established barricades. The Hawk attack was repelled by students who fought back, and successfully so, when these Hawks were only using sticks and clubs. The Hawks then regrouped and attacked again, this time with high-caliber rifles. The students tried unsuccessfully to hide. The regular police did not intervene because they were ordered to stand down. The shooting lasted for several minutes, during which police cars gave support to the paramilitary group, which included weapons, transportation, medical aid. Some injured students were rescued by ambulance drivers taken to the General Hospital Rubén Leñero, but the Halcones reached the hospital and they killed the youngsters there, many still in the operating rooms. The death toll was close to 120 teenagers, including one 14-year-old boy. Well, in the aftermath, the number of dead in the demonstration had discouraged students, and however, it also motivated others who later formed urban guerrilla organizations. Students in 1971 especially demanded democratization of education, control of the university budget by students, and the teachers they represented were 12% of the GDP. They also demanded political freedom, where workers, peasants, students, and intellectuals could enjoy real democratic freedoms and control the social system, quality education for everyone. I want to kind of skip up to the end of this Luis Echeverria administration, because as you can see, by the time he got out of office in 1976, he was pretty unhappy. His brother-in-law was in a federal prison, and he was very unpopular for the murder of Enrique Camarena, and after having been convicted in the Central District of California federal court. I remember this because I was fighting the feds in another courtroom right next door to it when this trial was going on. Ultimately, the First Lady's brother was sentenced to life in prison for Luis Echeverria tried to get him out of prison many times, but was unsuccessful. Now, as for the murder of Denis Prieto, In May 1970, I had attended a conference in Mexico City where I gave a report on our work at Ice Mountain. My wife and I stayed with Carlos and Evelyn. We had gone down there with a couple of other fellows, Les Davis, Barney Reeves, who stayed at the hotel. They were giving papers there also. Now, by this time, Ayari Prieto was 18 years old, and she was a young lady who was going everywhere with Rachel and Barney and Les, taking them all around and one thing or another. And Denise Prieto had kind of assigned herself to me. This is the girl that I told you I'd first heard giving a lecture on dialectical and historical materialism 8 years earlier when she was only 7. So she and I had traveled to the pyramids at Tehuacan and to the Museum of Anthropology and in Mexico City. And I know she'd come to my lectures. In fact, she'd even accompanied me to a dinner party that her father and mother took us to, arranged by a former SMERSH, S-M-E-R-S-H agent named Anita Boyer in her Mexico City apartment. A quick aside on that, Anita Boyer had been married to a man named Donald Boyer. He was the first atom spy caught in Canada. He confessed, and when he did, so the story went, he told his wife to get a divorce because he was expecting to go away to prison for a long time, maybe for life. At any rate, she did, after which she married a Vanderbilt who was sympathetic to the Communist Party, and she was married to him for a while, and then she got a divorce and a big multi-million-dollar settlement, and for some reason she moved to Mexico City, so the story went. All right, now the interesting part of this is that Carlos and Evelyn had invited me to go with them to meet her, and I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. Well, when we got there, knocked on the door downstairs for her to let us in, she came down and she said, oh, you brought Jason Smith with you. Now, at the time, I thought, well, Carlos had told her that he was bringing. I thought he probably hadn't told her he was bringing Denise, so that would be, that's 2 more plates that she might not have been prepared to serve. But at any rate, as Carlos said, this woman has millions of pesos. She could afford to serve 2 extra people. Not that that really was the point, but at any rate, I thought he probably had told her, but as soon as he could, he took me aside and he said, I didn't tell her you were coming. Something's wrong. You never met her before, did you? And I said, no, I've never met her. And when you invited me before, I was too busy in 1962 with what I was doing for the Cuban embassy, and I was preoccupied, so I had to decline the invitation. And I remember he said, well, we have to get out of here as soon as possible after dinner. Of course, I concurred. Skip up to the point. As soon as we could, we got out of there and we went back to Sonnet Hill, where we found that the Prieto home had been ransacked in our absence. The maids had gone home as they usually did, and afterward there had been no one to object. However, nothing of value had been taken, but my briefcase and associated luggage with paperwork that had accompanied me from Canada had been the obvious target, as it soon became apparent. There was such a mess of my things, especially that we concluded we had returned earlier than expected, and the intruders had been forced to leave early. We realized that the Mexican secret police could have done this. But Carlos had that avenue covered very well with his own spies, especially one who was next to the chief of the secret police in Mexico City. So we would have known about a raid if it had been planned. To make a longer story short, let me say that we realized then and there that Anita was not a former SMERSH agent, but still a very active one. And I later found out that the reason she left Canada is because Boyer was going to prison all right, but she was no longer needed as his controller. She married a Vanderbilt in order that money might be dumped into her account in some legal way. And she went to Mexico City so she could oversee Russian interests there. This was at a time when Russia and Cuba, although they were allies, were at each other's throat over secret intelligence work, because the Fidelistas were not about to submit to any kind of Russian domination of their intelligence service. Now, Carlos had been working for the Russians, now he was working for the Cubans. This is all background information. The red light on this thing is brink is blinking. So let me just conclude this by saying that in February 1974, Denis Prieto was part of a small group of students who had gone to Nepal, Mexico, that's in Mexico State, close to Morales State, where they were surrounded by secret police and army thugs and murdered, even though they had tried to surrender. Recently I noticed that there was a death photo of Denis Prieto on the internet. I haven't been able to find out where that came from, but this is why I had planned on getting revenge on that piece of shit, Luis Echeverria, which I did not do, and it's one of the few regrets I have in my life. At this point, we're going to have to stop because we're running out of time. In the next lecture, we're going to pick it up with the next 3 presidents of Mexico, and we'll keep doing that until we conclude Mexico, and then we'll go on to Central America, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, cover that area of the last half century.